Hi, everybody. In this, the last program in our series about different ideologies, we ask the seemingly odd question, where do our political beliefs originate? Joining us now for the full hour on that, in Berkeley, California, George Lakoff, professor of cognitive linguistics at the University of California at Berkeley. In New York, New York, Jost, professor of psychology at NYU. And here in studio, Jacob Hirsch, doctoral researcher in social and personality psychology at the University of Toronto. Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, and Christina Tarnopolsky, political science professor at McGill University. Good to have everybody here in the studio and in our Points Beyond for this discussion about why we believe what we believe. And George Lakoff, let me start with you out on the left coast and go through some of the theories about that very thing. We don't choose our politics, we inherit it. All of us learn our politics at the family dinner table. Is that about it?
Not so simple, but there's something important there. Certainly, voting patterns are most predictable on the basis of how your parents voted. But what's most interesting is that the way we reason depends upon idealized models of the family and the moral structure of the family. We have two basic kinds of family structures in this country, a strict father family and a nurturing parent family. And those are seen as idealized models, and they're projected metaphorically onto our politics in a very simple, straightforward way. And what makes it complicated is that most people have both of these views in the same brain via mutual inhibition. And they can be progressive on some issues, conservative on others, but depending on which is chosen, the same inference structure works. So it is very common for people to either pick up something from their own families, from families around them, or from the culture. But most of us understand both. And there are some, however, who are strictly one and not the other.
Jost, your research suggests that left-right differences are pronounced in many of life's domains. How is it that some of us embrace one and not the other?
Well, you ask a complicated question, you'll get a complicated answer. You've already alluded to one major factor, which is family socialization, but that seems not to be the entire story. There are, we know now, differences in personality and temperament that arise even relatively early in childhood that at least seem to be correlated with one's political orientation as an adult. There's even research that suggests somewhere between 40 and 50% of the statistical variability in political orientation may be attributable to genetic factors, which doesn't mean that whether you're liberal or conservative is per se determined by your genes. I think a more likely explanation for those kinds of results is that there are a set of psychological characteristics that are partially genetically heritable, which then predispose a given individual to gravitate toward liberal or conservative or left or right kinds of ideas, assuming that the individual is exposed to the full menu of ideological options.
Christina Tarnopolsky, let's take this discussion and move it back, let's say a couple of thousand years, maybe even further. If we were in ancient Greece, would we be having this same left versus right discussion? Did they have it then?
Well, they definitely didn't talk about liberal and conservative beliefs or left-right, but there was definitely a binary divide between the aristocrats and the democrats, and they also, a lot of these differences did correspond very closely to what Jost refers to as the sort of two core liberal-conservative divisions. One is tolerance of inequality, and the other is desire for either tradition, a strong tradition, which tends to correlate with conservatism, as is tolerance of inequality. And certainly the aristocrats quite often brought this up in democratic debates, that we needed to go back to tradition, we needed to prevent social reform, and we needed to stem off the tide of rising equality, whereas the Democrats were all about let's have social reform and more equality. So this occurred both during the 5th and the 4th century BC in democratic Athens.
So there are some aspects of what's happening today back then as well.
Definitely.
Okay. Yeah. Jordan, your view of how we inherit our parents' conservative or liberal leanings either way, how do you see it?
Well, I'm probably more in line with Dr. Jost's suppositions. I mean, our research has indicated that people choose their political beliefs based on their temperament, and temperament affects a whole broad variety of functions. I mean, Dr. Lakoff talked about family narratives. I mean, we've found, for example, that liberals are more agreeable and compassionate, and if that's a temperamental trait, it's going to manifest itself not only in the way the family is set up, so more nurturing, let's say, but also in a preference for a particular kind of voting pattern. And it looks to me like this temperamental trait, agreeableness, is a family-like trait. So, for example, if you're a mother and you have children, you want to be warm and empathic, you want to distribute resources relatively equally to all your children, you're more likely to be inclusive and merciful, and it's a fine model for raising small children. The conservatives that we've looked at are more, they look like they're more orderly, they're more conscientious, they're less agreeable. And a lot of that looks like it's deeply rooted in biology.
Jacob, let me bring you in at this point and ask about systems of ideas. If you are against abortion, for lower taxes, does that automatically mean you're going to be for the death penalty as well? In other words, do ideologies work as systems of ideas down a continuum?
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have one attitude if you happen to have another one that's related to that particular political preference, but they do tend to vary together. And so you can actually extract, when you look at a variety of different attitudinal measures related to social issues, there's two main factors that really account for most of the shared variance here. And what that means is people who feel about certain ways in relation to social hierarchies or equality or treating other people fairly, any attitude that is related to that topic, they tend to cluster together. Conversely, attitudes towards order or tradition or authoritarianism, they tend to cluster together as well. So they're, you know, social scientists have been saying this for almost 50 years now, saying that you really can't look at the political spectrum as a single unipolar dimension from left to right. You need at least a two-dimensional model to account for these very two different motivational systems in order to account for the types of attitudes that people have in the political domain.
Is that a recent phenomenon, or was it different 25, 50 years ago?
It's not, like, people have been talking about this since the 50s, really. Hans Eysenck was one of the first to start to look at the structure of values, and then Rokeach in the 70s as well. More recently, people are starting to rediscover this work and look at how you really need a multidimensional model to account for political orientation.
Because I noticed there's no Rockefeller Republicans anymore. And there are very few sort of conservative Democrats anymore either. Do you know what I mean? Everybody's kind of gone to the... We'll pick this up in a little bit. YouTube is filled with examples of people who proclaim on a bevy of issues, and our producer of tonight's program, Wojtek Schemberg, scanned many such proclamations on YouTube. This is apparently how he spends his time. And he found Dave. Now, Dave is also known by his YouTube handle, ZeroCool circa 1982. Let's play what Dave had to say, and then we'll come back and talk, okay? Roll tape, please.
I am pro-choice. It's women's right. I'm for low taxes, except for the top 3% of Americans. I'm for small government. The whole medical industry needs great regulation. I like the environment. I like green things. I would like to scrap the Department of Education. As a product of the Department of Education, I think it's a joke. Also for gay marriage, but to be honest, I don't really like gays. I feel very uncomfortable. I'm very homophobic around gay people. But regardless of my own personal feelings, they're an American just like you or I, and no better, no worse, just different.
Okay, Dave is pretty hard to put in a single silo, as that clip suggested, and also pretty interesting that he's not all that gay positive, but on the other hand, he's not against gay marriage. So let's start with George and John on this one. What determines how consistent our ideology is? George, to you first on that.
First, we have two baskets to put things in, is one way to put it, in our brains. And they can, the ideologies can switch back and forth on particular issues. They tend to fit together whenever they can, but it's very common for some people to be progressive on some issues, conservative on others, but once they've chosen which one it's going to be, the same logic occurs. That is, they're thinking the same way. And there are reasons why they fit together having to do with the way that the family structure is mapped onto various political domains, whether it's economics, religion, foreign policy, and so on. So you can't predict 100%. You can say, if they're, you know, they fit together here, you're probably going to get, you know, another position on this sort. But once you know that they're biconceptual, and then you have a very different situation. As for voters, that's a really interesting case. I was just involved in a recent poll in California that actually studied biconceptuals pretty much for the first time so far as I know. And in this poll, there were 18% shifting between progressive and conservative views depending on the language used, that is, depending on the framing of the issue and what they took the issue to be, whether it was seen from a conservative or progressive worldview. What that meant in California is that 40 to 45% were sort of strictly voting progressive, maybe 35 to 38 conservative, and a huge number, like 18%, being biconceptual and able to shift back and forth depending upon the language and the framing of the particular issue.
Can I just follow up on that? 18% in most polls would not be considered a big number. Why do you consider that to be a big number?
Because when you shift, it's 36%.
Oh, I see.
That is, when you take an 18%, going one way or the other way, that's huge, and 18% is huge anyway, because in a country that's largely split down the middle, where election, like the last election, was a 6% difference, which is really like 3.5% one way or the other, the 18% is huge.
Gotcha. Okay. John Jost, you want to come in on that? What determines how consistent our ideology is?
Well, political scientists have been studying that for almost 40 years, maybe even more. And they've identified, I think, a number of important factors. One is education. Another is political sophistication, involvement, engagement. So people who like politics and follow it closely are more likely to have attitudes and opinions that are closely aligned. I would say particularly around the two core dimensions that I think separate left from right, that is acceptance versus rejection of inequality, and advocacy versus resistance to social change. And which also, by the way, correspond somewhat, at least somewhat well, to economic liberalism, conservatism, and social liberalism, conservatism. And from what I heard of the YouTube person, Dave, I think his name was, he sounded to me like he would probably best be classified as a libertarian, which is commonly thought of as someone who's relatively social on liberal issues, but relatively conservative on economic issues. And I think he also was very forthcoming about the fact that, in some respects at least, he's personally uncomfortable, for instance, with gays and lesbians. So psychologically, he, in some sense, is more drawn to the conservative side of things, but he seems to be sort of overruling that in some sense with a cognitive principle that is about, I think, liberty or freedom or something.
Gotcha. All right, Jordan, let me follow up with the questionnaire that you two are working on here, Jordan and Jacob, because normally when people have their politics surveyed, they're asked a bunch of questions about death penalty, abortion, and what do you feel about taxes and all that kind of thing. But here are, and we'll just put some of them up here on the screen, here are some of the questions that you've asked in your survey. Questions such as, in general, I am very susceptible to colds, flu, and other infectious diseases. I avoid using public telephones because of the risk that I may catch something from the previous user. I prefer to wash my hands pretty soon after shaking someone's hand. My hands do not feel dirty after touching money. Okay, why are you asking questions such as these?
Well, one of the traits that's associated with conservatism is conscientiousness. And conscientious people are pretty good at keeping verbal contracts, and they're hardworking. And conscientiousness is positively associated with life success. Really positively associated with life success, about as much as intelligence. But we don't understand anything about conscientiousness. We don't have any good models of it. And so Jacob and I and some of my other students have been trying to understand the basis of conscientiousness for years with almost no luck. But recently we found that conscientious people are more sensitive to disgust. And the reason this is relevant to the political debate is because conservatives tend to be more conscientious, especially more orderly. Conscientiousness sort of breaks down into orderliness and industriousness, and conservatives are more orderly, which seems to mean that they like things to be in the category that they're supposed to be in. And we think that that's associated, we have some evidence, some strong evidence now, showing that that's associated with sensitivity to disgust at a very low biological level. And we think it might have something to do with the biological system that protects people from contamination. So contamination is a big problem, right? Because you can be contaminated with illness, you can be contaminated through sexual activity, you can be contaminated through food that's improperly stored, and so forth. And when you think about people's discussions about morality, they talk about corruption and rottenness, and they talk about parasites in the public domain, and it looks to us like one of the biological roots of conservatism is a hypersensitive disgust system. And this also speaks to something that's really different between conservatives and liberals, because liberals are high in this trait called openness. And openness is partly correlated with intelligence, but it's also partly associated with creativity. Liberals seem to like blowing apart the distinctions between categories because it excites them on an intellectual level and it's creative. Whereas the conservatives like to keep things in the boxes that they're supposed to be in because they respond to contamination between categories with the fear that when things get out of the place that they're supposed to be in, something bad is likely to happen.
Okay, Jacob, let me follow up with you. If disgust predicts conservatism, sort of, as you're suggesting here, are there visceral responses that would predict a liberal mindset?
Well, that's an interesting question, and certainly we're starting to understand more of the biological bases of these dispositions that lead to these different political orientations. And what seems to be associated more with the liberal mindset, again, you have to think of these as two separate dimensions, which means that biologically there's two different motivational systems. One appears to be associated with this disgust system and concern for order, but the other is more about compassion and concern for others and equality. And we're starting to understand the biology of that, but it's more of an emotional response related to empathy, for instance, as opposed to a disgust. So it's really two more or less orthogonal emotional and motivational systems that are underlying what I would say the conservative and liberal emotional responses that form these value bases.
Orthogonal?
Orthogonal, sorry, that would mean that they're separate from each other. They're not just one dimension that can be lumped into a single entity, but really you have to consider them as two separate things.
Jordan?
So that means that you can be high or low on both. And that also partly answers why people can have differing political opinions. Like the dimensional structure of political belief and the dimensional structure of personality don't exactly map. So for example, you could be high in orderliness and you could be high in empathy as well. And that would make you conflicted with regards to your political beliefs because there's part of you that would like the boundaries between things to remain constant and stable. But there's another part of you that would be empathic and want everybody to be part of the same family. And so, you know, that would make it difficult for you to figure out exactly who you're going to identify with politically.
Can I be disgusted and open at the same time?
Yes, you can be disgusted and open at the same time too. And under those circumstances, you know, you'd be orderly and conscientious and persistent, but there'd be elements of your intellect that would be interested in moving between the boundaries of things. So, but that would be more an intellectual or aesthetic experience, whereas the other one would be more deeply embodied and lower level in a sense.
Let me get some feedback in New York. John Jost, what do you think of this?
I agree with almost everything they said, although, I don't know, maybe they can be disgusted and open, but I'm not sure I can or most people can be. I think that in general, when you're disgusted or when you're threatened more generally, it's hard to maintain open-mindedness. And in fact, there's lots of experimental evidence that both threat and disgust tend to lead to what's sometimes referred to as motivated closed-mindedness. So sort of focusing, narrowing in on things, and being less open to information that is different, unfamiliar, and so on.
George, can I get some feedback from you on that?
Sure. I think those emotional parts that were just discussed are very real. They fit in with those family models that I've talked about. So, for example, in a strict father family, it's very important to, you know, keep the categories strict, follow the rules, and so on. You know, take care of yourself, all of those things, as opposed to having empathy for other people. And that's the empathy part. Empathy is the basis of progressive thought. It's the basis of progressive views of democracy, as Obama keeps saying. And this is a very important thing. Empathy is physical, just as anything else. It comes out of our mirror neuron system. And the question is how strong the connections are between the mirror neuron system and the emotional regions that characterize empathy. There are neuroscientists now studying this to see basically if they can look at thickness of connections in that region to be able to tell what kinds of politics someone has. This hasn't been established yet. It's still being studied. But there are clearly emotional correlates of all of these things. And what was correctly pointed out is that there are metaphorical projections of these emotions onto other areas. The idea of disgust, for example, comes up in the old kosher rules in Leviticus, where certain things are seen as disgusting when they're outside a normal category. For example, fish versus seafood, where seafood is seen as, sort of scavengers and so on, as opposed to fish. And those categories are seen as, traditionally disgusting, and like pigs associated with mud and so on. And therefore, you have strict rules, moral rules about these things. The idea of disgust as immorality is a very, very powerful metaphor where morality is purity. And that has to do with, goes into things like political corruption. So the emotional parts that are being identified here correctly have everything to do with politics and with their metaphorical projections onto particular issues and political traditions.
Christina.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating as well. If we think about Plato's Republic, he was also grappling with this issue as to whether people in a democratic polity could be both very open to new ideas, as well as, in some sense, at least able to have closure and have strict rules. And he actually theorizes that the element of the soul, thumos, that's responsible for both of these responses, in some sense, if it's educated correctly, there can be a balance. So he had no notion of separate emotional systems, but he certainly thought that in a good democracy, the citizens would have to balance a certain amount of openness, creativity, and novelty to new ideas with a certain amount of respect for order and tradition. And he actually analyzes sort of pathological personality traits. When people are too open, they become, as I label them in my book, sort of perverts who want the dissolution of all boundaries, or anarchists or tyrants. Or if they become too rigid and too desirous of tradition, they then become the kind of prudes that lead towards more authoritarian types. So he was already trying to look at these sorts of different personality types and the kinds of behaviors that they might lead to. And I think he thought that the best sort of personality is able to, in some sense, balance both of these personality traits.
I'm not sure what Plato would have thought about red states and blue states, but that's where we're going next. And just for the purposes of explaining this to our viewers, because it's the opposite in Canada from the United States, we're going to talk about some American data here. And of course, the red states in the United States are the Republican conservative states. The blue states in the United States are the sort of more liberal democratic states. It's the opposite in our country. Okay, here we go. This, again, our producer Wojtek Schemberg pulled off the, no, we're not going to this yet, Michael. Let's bring up middle of page 3. I want the Blake Hurst blog. A little description, a little telling description, actually, about what divides conservative and liberal sensibilities. And this is from a Missouri farmer. So Missouri, normally a red state. Blake Hurst is his name. He wrote about this almost a decade ago in the Wall Street Journal. Most red Americans, meaning red state Americans, can't deconstruct postmodern literature, give proper orders to a nanny, pick out a Cabernet with aftertones of licorice, or quote prices from the Abercrombie & Fitch catalog. But we can raise great children, wire our own houses, make beautiful and delicious creations with our 2 hands, talk casually and comfortably about God, repair a small engine, recognize a good maple sugar tree, tell you the histories of our towns and the hopes of our neighbors, shoot a gun and run a chainsaw without fear, calculate the bearing load of a roof, grow our own asparagus, live in peace without car alarms, security guards, or therapists, even find the same wife a lifetime source of interest and joy. Okay, that was then. George, come on in and talk about, are these kinds of lifestyle differences more telling than opinions about abortion and taxes, for example?
That's propaganda, largely. It has to do with the notion of a conservative populism, which is a creation, consciously created and effectively created, starting around 1967 with the Nixon campaign. Back then, what happened was this. After Goldwater had lost in '94 and everybody wanted to be a liberal,
64.
Working people, I'm sorry, in 64, I'm sorry, 64, working people wanted to be liberals. They were in unions and so on. And the question was, how do you get them to vote for Nixon? By 67, a lot of working people in the military were upset with the anti-war movement. They were threatened by feminism, and they were also threatened by the civil rights laws that led to blacks threatening their jobs. And therefore, the Republicans noticed that they could run Nixon as an anti-communist, as tough on crime, and having family values. The idea was that they noticed that there was biconceptualism in the workforce, that some people had really conservative views on those issues. At the same time, they invented the notion of the liberal elite, that is, the highly educated Northeastern liberal who was wealthy and looked down upon these poor working conservatives. This was an invented notion. Most liberals were not like that at all, and haven't been like that. In fact, it turns out that conservatives are more likely to have Brie and Chardonnay than liberals are, because they have more money. But the main thing about this is that for the last 40 years or more, conservatives have been pounding this idea in their message machine over and over and over, and progressives haven't countered it. And the result is that this has become part of the discourse structure of American politics. That's why this fellow who said that could get away with it.
Okay, let me show 3 different maps right now, and for our guests who are out of town, you're going to have to humor me on this a bit. I'll describe what's in the maps because you can't see them. You 3 here in the studio, just watch the monitors, because we are going to pursue this issue of the red-blue divide a little bit further. Here's map number 1. This is the 2008 U.S. election results. The red states are the ones that John McCain won. The blue states are the ones that Barack Obama won. And with a very few exceptions, where Obama did manage to capture some states which are normally so-called red states, that's the way America divided. You've got the West Coast, you've got the Northeast, basically in the blue, and you've got the West and Midwest and Deep South basically in the red. Okay, let's check another thing. How about for openness? This notion of openness. And again, if you remember the map we just saw, the states where there is more openness tended to be the blue states. The red states from the previous map, you can see, tend to be less open, the temperament of the people who live in them. Now let's look one more. If you consider conscientiousness, you get the exact opposite effect. Remember, on the West Coast and in the Northeast, you've got less conscientiousness. In the red states, Middle America, the Deep South, you've got more conscientiousness happening. Okay, taking into account all of the data that we've learned from those 3 graphs, John Jost, I have a one-word question. Explain.
Okay, thank you. I believe that you're describing work that I have done in collaboration with Jason Renfro, Sam Gosling, and Jeff Potter, in which we took very large internet samples of respondents who had completed these personality measures that enabled us to get a measure of openness and conscientiousness, among other things. And we found actually in the 96, 2000, 2004, every election, higher average levels of openness at the state level predicted more Democratic voting, and higher average levels of conscientiousness predicted higher levels of Republican voting. And there are really 2 fairly clear potential explanations for this, both of which I think are plausible. One is a sort of culture and social influence story, such that people are influenced by the characteristics, the social and psychological characteristics of the people around them, their neighbors and so on, so that over time individuals living in red states become more conscientious in some sense, and individuals living in more blue states because of their neighbors become more open. And a second possibility, which is not mutually exclusive with the first, is a kind of self-selection story, such that people over time move to those areas in which their social and psychological needs are best met, such that people who are high on openness tend to move to, in the United States, to the East Coast or the West Coast, or to major cities, large population centers that happen to be more diverse, have more cultural institutions, museums, galleries, music, all this kind of stuff that high openness people are interested in, and that also tend to be more liberal places, whereas people who are more interested in needs for order, structure, discipline, conscientiousness-related things, stability, and so on, either stay or move to red states.
Now, I guess we should say it's a trend, it's an indication. I mean, we had an author named Bill Bishop on the show not too long ago, had a book out called The Big Sort, which basically describes the trend that you've just described with these graphics. But you do have situations where, for example, in Austin, Texas, you've got this little patch of blue, very, very blue, in what is otherwise a very, very red state. But Christina, I'll bring you in at this point. The studies go on to show that conservatives have lower vocabulary scores. They are more judgmental compared to liberals, who are, quote unquote, smarter and more open-minded. Do conservatives have a right to feel kind of maligned by these kinds of studies?
Certainly, when I was reading the literature, I'm not all that familiar with this literature on liberal conservative beliefs and values, but I actually felt, I identify as a liberal, but I actually thought this seems not fair because, you know, I wouldn't want to be a conservative if I'm rigid, closed-minded, and so on, and who wouldn't want to be a liberal if that means you're creative and smart. But I think that what's interesting, and I think, again, going back to the ancients, and even John, in some of his work, actually argues, he cites a piece that's now looking at some of the negative affects, the negative consequences of too much openness. So I think in some sense the literature has focused a lot on the sort of overly rigid characteristics and behaviors that come out of conscientiousness, but if more literature starts to look at perhaps when people are too open, are there certain kinds of sort of pathologies there, which would make it sort of a more balanced view that, you know, there are both good and bad elements in both the liberal and the conservative camps.
Jacob, you want to pick up on that?
I think that's absolutely right. And the thing to remember is that, as Dr. Jost mentioned before, there is a huge genetic component to political attitudes. And what that means is that because there is still genetic variability in these basic dispositions, is that there is no optimal solution, right? There are trade-offs involved with one profile, there are trade-offs involved with the other. So really you need some kind of balance, because if ever you were to go too far to one extreme, that is not effective enough to deal with the complex environment that is the natural world and the social world as well. And so both of these strategies appears to be necessary to try and eke out a living in human society.
Let's get Jordan and Christina.
Well, so here's why conservatives need liberals. Liberals are far more likely to be entrepreneurial.
Liberals are?
Yes, because it's managerial skill that's associated with conscientiousness, but it's entrepreneurial skill that's associated with openness. Okay, now here's why liberals need conservatives. Liberals are agreeable and empathic, and they want everybody in one group, but they don't know what to do with cheats. Now, conservatives don't like cheats. Now,
they know what to do with cheats.
They know what to do with cheats. They punish them, even if they're the cheater. Now, if you look at the performance prediction literature, what you see is that there's a very tight relationship between intelligence and conscientiousness and life success. It's one of the most, if you use those two predictors to predict life success, it's one of the most powerful predictors in all of science, not just in social science. So the liberals might be a little bit more verbally fluent and a little bit more open, but the conservatives are harder working. And so that balances out. They don't have to feel so bad about that. And now, the corollary to if you're smart and hardworking, you do well, is that if you're not very bright and you're not hardworking, you do badly. Now,
right.
People don't like that, especially liberals, because that indicates that there are people who are at the bottom of the heap who are there because they don't have the ability nor the desire to do anything productive.
As opposed to it's society's fault.
Right. And if you only use empathy as a basis of judgment for that category, what you end up with is that everybody at the bottom of the heap has been victimized. And I don't think the evidence suggests that, because conscientiousness is a very, very good predictor of life outcome in relatively civilized societies. And that indicates that individual hard work actually makes a difference with regards to status. And I think liberals have a hard time dealing with that.
Christina, then George.
Yeah, just very quickly, I agree too. The other thing to focus on is the fact that liberals need conservatives and conservatives need liberals. And in fact, the Democratic Athenians quite often talked about this, where they said, you know, we're open and we're open to discussion, but we, at a certain point, in order to function, we need closure. And a lot of Plato's criticisms of democratic Athens were around the fact that they were either becoming, in certain points in their history, far too closed and not allowing the right kind of democratic debates, but at other times being far too open and allowing anything. And it's actually interesting that at the time of the plague, the sort of large amount of deaths led people in much more ideologically opposed camps. A number of people became more conservative. The sort of fear of death led people to become really, we've got to go back to the old ways. But the other reaction of what we would call liberals, they would call Democrats, was, who cares? You know, if we're all going to die, we may as well just not care anymore.
Which plague are you referring to here?
The plague of 429 BC, which actually killed Pericles as well. Yeah.
Okay. George, you want to come in on that? Not necessarily the plague, but some other angle.
I think that limiting this discussion to personality traits misses very important parts of the conceptual system of progressives and conservatives. For example, the highest value in the conservative system is preserving and extending the system itself. That explains, for example, why you have almost all conservatives voting against Obama's proposals, even when they brought up the proposals themselves and Obama accepted them, then they'll vote against them because they would help Obama if they voted for them. And they would not just help Obama politically, but it would go against the power of their own system of thought. So there are within that system moral constraints and intellectual constraints that don't just fit these personality traits. The same thing is true with respect to the notion of causation and risk. In causation, conservatives think largely in terms of direct causation. You know, did you do it? Are you guilty? Should you be punished? Etc. Whereas liberals tend to think more in terms of systemic causation. That is, there are social causes as well as individual causes of things. Social causes of crime, social causes of poverty. And this is built into the conceptual system, not merely the emotional system. And you miss that if you just look at these emotional indicators.
John, I should give you a chance to sort of come full circle here and answer the question about whether conservatives ought to feel miffed by the study, by I guess the results that you come up with in your studies. What do you say?
Well, I think I agree with much of what's been said, that there are positive and negative aspects of both left and right orientations. But I think the social scientists can't worry too much about whether people like his or her results. I think that our duty is to the data, however they come out. And so it may be that the truth is in some happy middle place or something, but I'm not convinced of that necessarily yet. And I also think that social and behavioral scientists should be trying at least to deal with social problems in society. And I guess if we ask, at least in the United States, maybe it's different in Canada, but in the United States, do we have bigger problems due to excessive openness, or do we have bigger problems because of excessive rigidity and closed-mindedness and intolerance? I think the latter, and so I think if social and behavioral scientists focus more on the latter, I don't think they should be faulted or blamed, although, of course, it may upset some people.
That's life. Jordan.
Well, I'd like to just make a couple of comments about Dr. Lakoff's systemic observations. The relationships that I described between these individual variables, intelligence, say, which is highly heritable, and conscientiousness, which is also highly heritable, are of unbelievably large magnitude. So there isn't actually an awful lot left for other factors to explain in a society like ours. I'm not saying that, you know, social events have absolutely no causal role, but individual differences make a huge difference, far bigger difference than anybody ever imagined. So I can give you an example with regards to productivity. If you have 20 employees in your company, the top 1 in 20 is 16 times as productive as the bottom 1 in 20. And that's a conservative estimate, and those statistics are well documented. and with regards to social influences, for example, you might say, for example, that poverty causes crime. That might be a liberal attitude, for example. It's quite common. The data actually suggests that relative poverty causes crime, which is not the same thing at all, because as soon as you start to talk about relative poverty in rich nations, for example, which Wilkinson has done recently, you start to bring in emotions like resentment and desire for revenge and all sorts of things that aren't associated with the mere fact that people are outcasts, and that's why they might be indulging in negative behavior. So the individual differences story is a lot more powerful than people think.
We've got about 10 minutes to go here, and let's spend that time talking about, as we go forward, do we fight or do we try to persuade the other side? And to that end, I want to start by reading a view expressed a few years ago by a British journalist named Will Hutton, who said the following in Prospect magazine: "The key argument in the decades ahead will be between moral fundamentalists, animated by faith or nationalism or some combination of both, and Enlightenment liberals. The moral fundamentalists are ideological magpies. They are often quite ready to back protectionist economic policies, high public spending, and strong welfare support, especially for the so-called deserving poor. They are even anti-business, especially if it is global. They distrust globalization. They are instinctive censors and are anti-science. They distrust gender equality and believe in traditional sex roles. They are on the march everywhere, insisting on tolerance, the rule of law, equality, liberty, rationalism, science, solidarity, pluralism, and human rights before this rising movement is the battle of our times. It may prove harder to win than the 20th century victory over fascism and communism." Let's pull that apart. George, has he, in your view, accurately outlined essentially the battlefield for our time?
Well, I think he went overboard, but let's look at it. Right now, both here and in Europe and in other places in the world, conservatism, American style, is spreading because of political consultants actually going around the world and getting political actors to move in those directions. And progressives around the world, social democrats in Europe, for example, are having a tough time combating it because they don't understand how it works. A lot of progressives have the Enlightenment reason idea, which turns out to be empirically false. All of cognitive and neuroscience shows that Enlightenment reason doesn't work most of the time. Yet some people still try to act as if it does. What really is involved is things like metaphor, frames, emotions, and so on. But the real battle does have to do with these strict father, nurturing parent views, which are reflected in some of these personality characters. But what's important is something where I disagree with John. The issue of what defines a problem has to do with those moral worldviews. So it is not a problem for conservatives if most of the people in a country are poor and a very small number are wealthy. That is a problem for progressives, and but what counts as a problem has to do with your worldview, and therefore correspondingly with some of your personality traits.
Equal time for you, John?
Well, that was interesting. I always enjoy talking to George, for sure. I actually have no problem with the example he gave. In fact, we've provided empirical evidence to support that example. Specifically, we found that over the last 30 years or so, as the degree of income inequality in the United States has increased rather steeply, as measured by the Gini coefficient and other macroeconomic indicators, we have found that correlated with that growth of income inequality is a decrease in subjective well-being, happiness, self-reported satisfaction, and that decrease is indeed much steeper for liberals than it is for conservatives. It's absolutely the case that inequality is more troubling psychologically for liberals than it is for conservatives. So I absolutely agree with his example, and I agree to some extent about the general point that certainly people are likely to perceive certain problems as more or less important as a function of their own ideological proclivities. But I still think there's some role for social behavioral scientists to try to come up with some objective ways of identifying problems that should be worked on. And that's the case whether everybody agrees or not.
Christina, this journalist has put it forward as the kind of the war for the 21st century. And and he wrote that actually before Barack Obama's victory and before Tea Party movements and all of that. I mean, it's fairly prescient if you look at it that way. But do you think he's right that one side needs to defeat the other, as we did in the 20th century with fascism and communism?
No, I mean, I think one thing that he might be doing, which I think all of us in this discussion aren't doing, a number of us want to argue that personality traits are important for political behaviors. They are by no means our fate or determining. He's sort of taking a very fatalistic view. There are going to be these camps, and there's going to be this war, and there always will be these wars, and they can't come together, and there can be no reconciliation. And I think that's an oversimplification of the view that certain personality traits or ideologies are completely sort of closed off from one another, and that our personality traits are always going to determine our behaviors. And I think, pardon me, all of us, just like Plato did, argues that yes, personality traits are important, but they're one factor, as are political institutions. And democracy is specifically a kind of political society in which we actually have institutionalized opposition so that people have to hear the other side, so that there can be a kind of moderation between these two views. So I think that kind of view needs to be tempered by the view that democracy itself is always a recognition that both innate temperaments, but also society and social arguments and deliberations are what are going to determine our future.
Jacob,
So,
I think it was about 45 minutes ago I mentioned that the days of the Rockefeller Republicans seem to be over. The days of the very conservative Democrats seem to be over. If things are so deeply ingrained right now at the edges, is the idea of political persuasion gone?
No, I don't think it's gone, but I think you have to be focusing on the right people. And I think Dr. Lakoff emphasized this in terms of the framing effects, right? So for some people who have one strong motivation for order, at the very extreme, they don't care about equality of the other, you're not going to change their minds. No matter what you say to them, they're very convinced of their own worldview. They construe their values in a very specific way. That's it. Same thing with the other side, the ones who don't care about order at all. They just want to focus on progress and equality. You're not going to convince them of anything. It's the people in the middle who actually have a relative balance between these motivational systems. They're the ones who can actually be influenced by persuasive messages and by propaganda, by framing campaigns.
But it seems like that middle is disappearing and people are heading to the edges.
No.
You could make the argument, but I think from a genetic perspective, because remember, there is a genetic influence here. You know, you can't really change people's genes, at least not yet. And so they still have the potential for recognizing both of these different value systems.
Okay, let me hear Jordan, and then George, I heard you trying to get in as well.
You know,
Jordan
Jacob
first.
made a point earlier that the reason that these systems exist is because without them, people couldn't survive. So we've evolved a system for compassion, and we've evolved a system for conscientiousness, and they're different systems. And you need both of them. That's why they exist, and that's why there's variability. And so instead of things being polarized, as this journalist suggests, there's always the possibility that people could listen to one another and try to understand that, you know, person A brings a certain set of temperamental claims to the table that are important, even though they might not be all-encompassing. And that person B brings another set, and that the opportunity that a democratic society provides is to produce a place where both of those temperaments can contribute what they have to the society at large. I mean, as I said, the liberals are good entrepreneurs. The conservatives should be happy about that, you know. And if you're very closed-minded and you're mean-spirited, you're very low in agreeableness, you're going to be, you know, you're going to tilt towards fascism pretty heavily, and that's not such a good thing.
George, you got about a minute and a half here, and you took exception to my suggestion that people seem to be scurrying to the extremes rather than hanging around the middle. How come?
Well, that has to do with the fact about communication systems. We now have communication systems that are very sophisticated, and the conservative communication system is really effective in activating the conservative worldview in people's brains, which makes it stronger. Remember, the more you hear language that activates a given worldview, the stronger that worldview is in your brain. The idea that if you have two worldviews, then they are balanced is just wrong. First of all, the two worldviews can be about different subject matters, and the subject matters can vary from person to person. Secondly, when one is strengthened, the other is weakened because they are mutually inhibitory in the brain. And the result is that if you have a conservative communication system that is more effective than a progressive communication system, that is going to be, you know, making that stronger and stronger and making the progressive system relatively weaker in those people who are the shifters, who can go back and forth. As remember, I said there was an 18% shift in California. I mean, that's an important number of people. And you have to look at that, and it's not that they're balanced, and it's not like they have equally amount to contribute in the same areas. They bind to different areas.
One thing that is equal on every program, George, is the clock. We get 60 minutes and then we got to go. That's our time this evening. George Lakoff from the University of California, Berkeley, John Jost, NYU. I want to thank both of you for joining us on the line from points beyond in the United States. Jacob Hirsch from the U of T, Christina Tarnopolsky from McGill University, Jordan Peterson on the other side of the table from U of T. My thanks to the three of you for coming into our studio tonight.